Hello, I'm Vass. My first job back in the halcyon days of 2010 was organising cultural events very much like this one, where I would invite leading philosophers and artists, writers and scientists to talk about their ideas and tell us a little bit about where they thought the world was heading. One thing that you get very good at very quickly if you meet so many leading thinkers is sounding much cleverer than you actually are. I can do 30 seconds on anything from particle physics to geopolitics. After that, I have to change the subject, lest you figure out how ignorant charlatan I actually am. Unfortunately, 30 seconds isn't long enough for a TED Talk, so when I was invited here by the organisers of this conference, I had to sit down and think about what, if anything, I could actually claim to be an expert in. And what I came up with was this: being incredibly miserable and in your 20s. Unfortunately, I quickly found out that all of my friends were experts too, as were their friends and their friends and their friends. Advice, Baz Luhrmann once said, is a form of nostalgia, so allow me to reminisce to some of the highlights of my 23rd year. I was living in a rat-infested apartment in a Chinese industrial megacity where every time I flushed the toilet, sewage water would leak out of the floorboards in the living room. I was interning for 16 hours a day for months and months trying to get a paid job. I split up with the only woman I had ever loved and moved back in with my parents, who are lovely, but in my defense, didn't really want to live together either. Middle-aged people expect to go through a crisis when they realize they're no longer young. But young people are expected to be having the time of their lives. That means there's a hell of a lot more advice out there for dealing with the problems of being 42 than the problems of being 22. And I didn't even realize until after I was through with this period that it has a name, which is the quarter-life crisis. Today, I work for an organization called the School of Life. Our mission is to help people develop their emotional intelligence. And we do that through films, through books, through workshops, and through classes where we teach you everything that you wished you'd learned in your real school, from how to find a job that you'll love to how to face death. Now, most of the people who come to the School of Life's classes are a fair bit older than you guys and already in the midst of other existential crises. But I think it's best to be prepared for the storm before it hits. So with that in mind, I've stolen some of my favourite ideas from the school's curriculum and brought them here for you today. Just put them in your back pocket until you need them a few years down the line. Oh, before you ask, I'm 30 now, so everything I'm about to tell you has been scientifically proven to be true. What is the quarter-life crisis? Well, an American psychologist called Jeffrey Arnott coined the term emerging adulthood to describe a new conception of development from the teens through to the 20s, with a particular focus on the ages of 18 to 25. Now, Arnott found in a study of millennials, which is the media's favourite term for my generation, that very few of us thought of mortgages, marriage and kids as the key symbols of adulthood. After all, none of these things precludes you from behaving like a child. Instead, we preferred to think of adulthood as being achieved when you were financially independent and able to accept responsibility for your actions. But a third of those Arnott surveyed still hadn't achieved these milestones between the ages of 25 and 29. So what's stopping so many people from feeling financially independent and personally responsible? Well, coming of age in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, young people globally are, according to The Economist newspaper, an oppressed minority, albeit an unusual one, held back by their elders. We're the most educated generation in history, thanks to improvements in nutrition and schooling, but our talents are being squandered. Globally, job markets are biased in favour of older people. And in the big cities where there are lots of jobs, house prices have skyrocketed, meaning home ownership for us is a very distant prospect. That means a lot of us are more financially dependent on our parents than is strictly emotionally healthy, and that makes us the lucky ones. Add to that a psychological component. In your early 20s, life loses a lot of its structure. Throughout your education, what success means and how you get there is pretty clearly marked. And for university students like you guys, that's coupled with a good deal of personal freedom. But once you graduate and enter the workforce, all of that is lost. Suddenly you're faced with an enormous, incomprehensible number of different options and choices to make, but you have no roadmap telling you which ones are the best to take. And when that happens, your sense of who you are is bound to be fractured. Now, 5 years ago, statisticians in the US, UK and Europe found that the romance of youth is actually a myth. As Simon was saying earlier, happiness isn't a kind of downward curve from the joy of youth to the misery of old age. It's actually more like a U-bend. It drops off very sharply in your early 20s, continues to plummet all the way into middle age, and then only recovers in your 60s. But that isn't because 60-somethings are having wildly better lives. It's actually because they've learned to accept who they are and become grateful for what they have. Now, that's great advice, and appreciating what you have can help mitigate against the worst of the quarter-life crisis. But I don't believe it's the only thing that can be done, otherwise I wouldn't be here today. And for the rest of my time, I'm going to suggest a few tips that you can use to deal with one of the most traumatic elements of the quarter-life crisis, which is finding a career that you actually find emotionally fulfilling and enjoyable. Okay. I'm going to start with the odd one out round from Have I Got News for You. Does everyone know how to play this game? I want you to tell me what 3 of these people have in common and one of them does not. And they are Amy Winehouse, the Renaissance playwright Christopher Marlowe, Alexander the Great, and the Joker. Any thoughts? The answer isn't that 3 of them are humans and one of them is a manifestation of the darkness in Batman's id. The correct answer is that Alexander was the only one who lived into his 30s. How depressing is that? Everyone here knows what it feels like to be envious of someone. And one way that envy manifests itself in the quarter-life crisis is as a sense that you're a humiliating failure because you failed to live up to the glorious achievements of your 20-something heroes, right? There will always be people who, through talent and luck, achieve extraordinary things in their 20s, up to and including holding Gotham City to ransom. But these people are freaks. Not just Heath Ledger, but all of them. I'm sure you can all think of one. Maybe it's Zadie Smith writing White Teeth on the kitchen table, or Mark Zuckerberg founding Facebook in his dorm room, or even Steven Spielberg directing Jaws. The reason that we know their stories so well is because they play into this idea that youth is a romantic and brilliant time of flourishing. But the truth is, people achieve extraordinary things at all stages in their life. Mother Teresa never even saw a poor person until she was 40. Stan Lee created the Fantastic Four in his late 30s, and the rest of the Marvel Universe followed thereafter. Joseph Conrad, one of the greatest writers in the English language, didn't even speak it until his 30s. And in her 20s, J.K. Rowling was a single mother living in relative poverty, watching the rejection slips pile up high for her obscure children's novel. Even if envy doesn't manifest in you towards the rich and famous, it's very likely that you'll find it manifesting towards perhaps older siblings who you deem to have been successful, other family members or friends, or even in a much vaguer way towards the 20-something heroes who are having wild times in all of those sitcoms you used to watch as a teenager, like Scrubs and Friends and whatever is on E4 these days. It's a very dangerous emotion, and if you let it, it will eat you up from the inside. But at the School of Life, we think that envy can be turned on its head and can, in fact, become something that's very useful to you if you consider it maturely and critically. So, the way to do this is to push past the superficial reason that you think you envy someone and find what signal underneath that you might actually want to bring into your own life. For example, let's say I envy Steve Jobs, and when I think of Steve Jobs, the first thing that pops into my head is he's a playboy billionaire who founded a global megacult. Okay, ignore that impulse and keep digging. When I think about it, what I might find is what I really truly admire about Steve Jobs and want to bring into my life from his life is his ability to turn the ugly and functional part of life into something that's beautiful and desirable. So he turns people's needs into things that people actually want. And that is a useful signal that I can then build on when I'm thinking about what I want to do in my career. I've got another exercise to suggest, and it's this. Think about what you would want to do in your life if you were going to die 10 years from now. So, suppose you were going to drop off this mortal coil around the same time as old Alexander of Macedon here. It's too long to do nothing. Does something crystallize in front of your mind, giving you a sense of purpose and vision? Is it something that you would want to achieve so badly that you would be quite happy to fail at it, knowing that you had at least tried to do it? If so, my advice to you very strongly is to go for it. Forget the advice from people telling you to get a stable, sensible job. If you want to be truly successful at something, you have to put in way more than the 9 to 5. And you can only do that if you're driven because you have a passion for it and truly want to succeed at it. So, if you have that vision crystallizing in front of you, go for it. Now, what about those of you who don't necessarily see anything in front of your eyes when you do that exercise? What about those of you who don't want to be a tech billionaire or a Batman supervillain? What can you do to have something emotionally fulfilling in your career? Well, you could take a personality test. The most famous of these is called the Myers-Briggs, and it puts you into one of 16 different personality types, from which a careers counsellor can then choose a list of suggested vocations. Just one problem with this, which is you'll get dull and unimaginative options written by dull and unimaginative people. If Mozart was doing the Myers-Briggs test, they would probably say, do something creative, like marketing or starting a cake decorating business. Okay. At the School of Life, we're not interested in databases, and we believe the answers are best found if you look inward. In your 20s, the changes that you're going to undergo are highly turbulent, but instead of resisting those and sticking doggedly to a path set upon by a teenager that you can no longer recognize, trust your new hunches and instincts, but follow them in a controlled and experimental way that mitigates against the risk. Now, one way to do this is on a gap year. I'm sure many of you are thinking about gap years now, maybe teaching English abroad or bumming around the world's most beautiful beaches. But I want to suggest another kind of gap year, devised by a colleague of mine, Roman Krasnarek, who was inspired by some of the world's leading business experts and psychologists. This is the idea. You write down a bunch of things that sound like they might be cool to do. Don't limit yourself to the white-collar jobs advertised in the pages of The Guardian. Be imaginative. Maybe it's starting a brewery in the south of France, becoming a tree surgeon, building the giant-sized household objects that they use as props in TV adverts. Whatever. Put it on a list and keep going until you've got 20 things, 30 things. Then put it in a drawer, come back a week or two later and take it out. Start slashing off things that now seem fanciful or dull. Whittle the list down. Now, when you've got it down, devise a series of controlled experiments that you can undertake over the course of this year that will allow you to test how much you actually enjoy these potential vocations. For example, maybe you need to learn French and then do a brewery tour. Maybe you need to climb some trees and see how much of a rush you get from that. Maybe you want to meet up with a friend of a friend who works in TV advertising and really grill them over coffee about what the job actually entails. Don't just limit yourself to conventional work experience and internships. As you're undertaking these experiments, some of them will be boring and you won't enjoy them. Forget those options. The ones that you enjoy, grow them. Come up with more extensive and in-depth and exciting experiments along those lines that will enable you to test those careers more thoroughly. By the end of the year, you will have an incredible understanding of where your talents and your passions meet the needs of the working world. And you will be a hell of a lot more interesting as a person than if you just accepted the first corporate grad scheme that came your way. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.